words that come out of my mouth come out properly on the ears of this congregation, down to their hearts and out through their lives, this day and every day. Amen. So friends, we've been going through the book of Acts, and we took a little bit of a jump this week to go, we'll go forward to come back a little bit, because I think this story has so much importance in this series. But I first want to ask you today, who is your favorite biblical character? Oftentimes we see many different people in this book. Good, bad, in between. One of my favorites is Peter. We've talked about Peter quite a bit. But my second favorite would have to be Saul/Paul. Same person, just changed a lot after this encounter with Jesus. Because simply, in some ways, I feel like I can relate. But let's get to the meat and potatoes of this story today. This story of Saul is very intense. And if you look earlier, when you see Stephen's murder, Saul was right there. He was part of the people who would stone him to death. Saul was known for persecuting Christians. Paul was, in my mind, misled by the people that he followed. Those same people who murdered Jesus on a cross. When you're in with a group, many people in that group do as the leaders say. I feel like Saul was following the leader in many ways in what he was doing. Saul was completely committed to the law, just like the disciples were completely committed to Jesus Christ. Saul was a follower, and a misled follower at that, which led him to this point. He was on his way to Damascus to do what? To harm people of the way, also known as believers in Jesus Christ, to bind them and bring them in front of the chief priest to then be sentenced to whatever that might be. But on this travel to Damascus, something amazing happened, and Jesus showed up to him. And I don't know if at the time Saul would have thought that this was amazing, as we do today. But Jesus closed his eyes. Jesus kept him from seeing and brought a challenge into his life. He brought a challenge into his life. Things such as scales were over his eyes as he continued to go to Damascus. But in all reality, someone who did not believe in Jesus would have had one of two options. He would have either thought, okay, I'm going to listen to this. Jesus came to me and now something's wrong and I'm going to listen to this. Or I can go back and, being a high-ranking official, probably get the best medical attention in all of Jerusalem and try and get this figured out. This was a test on Jesus' part for Saul, to see if he would continue to be changed after this encounter with Jesus, or if he was going to go back to what he knew was safe. We know as we see this story which way Saul turned. We know that he continued to go on to Damascus. For 3 days he stayed there, did not eat or drink, but simply prayed. And then enters in another character, and that's Ananias. Ananias was a faithful follower of the way in Damascus. He was not at the level of the apostles at that time, but a faithful follower nonetheless. Jesus had came to both Ananias and to Paul, saying that they would meet, and this is how Paul would regain his sight. The biggest point of this, friends, is Ananias was faithful. You see him, Ananias, backtracking a little bit. Lord, I've heard what this guy's done. What if I regain his sight and then he persecutes me? A very likely thought in his mind would be that knowing Saul, he'd be taken away. He'd be bound and taken to the chief priest to be persecuted. But Ananias was faithful. Without Ananias, a lot of the New Testament would not have happened, friends. He gets glossed over quite often, but he is so vital in Saul's story due to his faithfulness. So at this point, after the scales had been removed from Saul's eyes, he began to learn from the disciples. He began to preach the good news, and he began to lead people, lead Jews to a relationship with Jesus as the Messiah. This is impressive. This is a big turning point. God took somebody who was as far from in God's corner to being the person to spread the good news to all of the world. At that point in time, what they thought was all of the world. From the lowest to the highest. That's Saul's story. He found the way to God, and he became faithful. Friends, this is what we call conversion. Accepting Jesus Christ into our hearts and our lives and being changed by it. That's the biggest point. And I'll get to my story a little later, but it's being changed by it that makes conversion important. Now, we see many different conversion stories in the Bible. Moses, at the burning bush, had a moment where God came to him, and he was changed from that point, and he led the Israelites for a long, long, long time. Samuel, we see him called by night as a child. And although he may have known God at that time, he was still changed by God at that moment and became something that he wasn't before. The disciples, when they were called to follow Christ, once again probably knew God at that point, but they were changed by this experience when Jesus told them, drop your nets and I can have you fish for the souls of people. And many more. I'm sure you guys could bring up many more times of conversion in the Bible. And it's so important today that we win people over for Christ. Because it's all that we have is Christ and Christ alone. To go back into my childhood a little bit and talk about my conversion story. My story started, I would have been 14 at a Rock the River music festival where Billy Graham kind of got all these Christian artists together and had this altar call at the end of it. And I had been going to youth group for about a couple months. And I thought, why not? Let's just go up there and see what it's all about. And at that point, many people would say that I got saved. But I was never changed from it. Once again, we said that conversion is about change. So at that point, I was not changed by what had happened. I went home, and it was as if nothing had changed. Fast forward less than a year, I went to Chrysalis, and I've told you guys this story many times. And at that point, I was changed. Some. I was a better person at church. I was a better person at church functions. I was better. But I still sinned and fell short of the glory of God in many ways, in many conversations, to many people. And although I would say that that was my conversion moment, I had a lot of growing to do. And it wasn't until a friend asked me to go back to church after my first year of college when it finally clicked. When I finally said, I'm ready to make a true change in how I study, a true change in how I talk, a true change in how I walk, this Christian walk. And that's my point, is that conversion is not always as fast as what we see with Saul. Conversion is not always as fast as what we saw with Moses at the burning bush. Our conversion, our continuing to grow, could be little moments or big moments along the way that allows us to become better than we were yesterday. What's your conversion story? Many of you probably have one. It may not be a burning bush. God may not have put scales over your eyes. I hope not. But what's your conversion story? If you had it, what were your scales over your eyes? What was that moment of the hardest point? And my next question is, who was your Ananias? Who was it that God used to bring you into the faith? Many of you may look around at a pew of somebody that once was here, or who might still be here. Who was your Ananias? Who brought you into the fold? And finally, friends, my last question is, what is their conversion story? The people that don't know it yet. The people that will find Jesus in some way, shape, or form. As I said in our call to worship, the people that we think need it the most, or the people that look like they need it the least. What is their conversion story? And how can you be the Ananias to their story? How can you simply extend your faith into their lives? That's my question for you to ponder this week. How can you extend your faith into their lives? At their lowest point, at their highest point, whenever it is, how can you extend your faith into their lives? Amen.